Hello everybody again, this is the video for assessment item 2. This is the mentorship scenario and it's worth 60%. It's due on the 15th of October and will be returned to you by the 6th of November. It has a length of 2,200 words, which excludes the reference list and the appendices, and there'll probably be quite a number of appendices. There'll be a decent number of pages that you'll put together at the end of that paper. None of that's counted in the word count, so you can go berserk with that and add as much as you like. And your reference list doesn't count, but your in-text citations will count in the word limit, and you'll be able to go up to 10% above that because it's a one-off number. So our standard process is to give you 10% above the word limit, so you'll be able to write up to 2,420, I think, whatever, 10% above 2,200 words. So the purpose of this scenario is to allow you to explore the different questions, and I've given you a really fairly broad sort of discussion around your clinical area to help you pull these questions to bits. But you've been asked by your manager to support Dale, who's a staff member with a specific learning need, and I'll show you the examples in a moment that you're going to use. The manager explains that she's identified you as a transformational leader and she's asking for your assistance to support and mentor Dale on this basis. So the first question is to identify pre-existing educational opportunities that exist and are accessible online that you could realistically incorporate into your support of Dale's learning needs. Provide a rationale for your choices in these resources. So identify means to clearly show us what they are. So if you randomly sort of talk about, oh yeah, there's something to do with hand hygiene, if that was the topic, there's modules online you could do. That's not identifying them. Identifying them is telling me that the Hand Hygiene Australia website includes an e-learning module that could be used, and it's really explaining what's involved in that. That's identifying your strategy. Now, the purpose of this question is to think about if you are helping a person with a particular learning need, and suppose you're a clinician or that you're the educator, that you've got a lot of work on already, that you're not going to have time to spend 2 weeks to develop a really involved, brilliant sort of learning package that takes him through thoroughly everything he needs to do. If you're doing a one-on-one mentorship with someone and providing them resources, it's probably going to be largely pre-existing. You might knock together some stuff. You might decide that Dale is a good example of what the rest of your staff need to do as well, and that sort of everyone struggles with the same thing. But if this is a particular staff member, which is what the scenario identifies, with a learning need that other people don't have, then it doesn't make sense to make resources from start to finish and put a lot of time and effort into making something. It makes sense to be aware or to research particular opportunities that would be useful for this learning need. So the particular things that you find will be based on the topic, and I'll show you the 2 scenarios I've already put together in a minute. But you're looking at what are the learning needs of this person, how do they learn, and there's not a huge amount of detail in that scenario, so you might decide that would help drive your thing. You might mention that in your response, that depending on how Dale is able to use these resources, he might prefer to use something else. You might talk about how you might come to that decision. That's part of your rationale. You're making decisions about what resources would be useful. Part of it's got to be about tailoring it to his needs as well. So write about that, include that in your discussion. But the example I just gave, hand hygiene is not the topic, but if someone was consistently not washing their hands, the hand hygiene modules on the Hand Hygiene Australia website would be a really good place to go. It's mandatory training for New South Wales Health staff. I'm sure it's still the case now, and would probably be used in a lot of other areas, particularly in Australia, in other health services as well. But it's nifty. It's got a lot of benefits to it in the sense that it's self-driven. You can send the person a link and they can go off and do it themselves. You might set it up and use it with him in the workplace and make sure he can access it and understands how it works, but he can be doing that learning without you present. So you can be doing learning. It's got videos and pictures and things, so it goes across more than one learning style. There's lots of reasons you might use it. It gives you a certificate for the thing you finish at the end, so there's evidence that he's completed that work, which is good. If you give him something to just read, there's no evidence he's completed anything. So that's an example of an e-module. That's one of the things you might do. You might have others as well, but the point is you look at what the need is, what the problem is, and you work out what are the solutions that already exist online that I could access. Now it says educational opportunities, it doesn't say e-modules. So if there are e-learning options that are like modules and videos and things, that's fine. It also says anything that's really available online, which is just about anything. So you might decide that there's really not a lot in the way of modules, that e-learning processes, and that stuff would be brilliant, but it's not available for this particular topic. So you might find websites with case scenarios in it, or journal articles that are particularly good explaining the problem. You might come up with a suite of things that are useful to this person that you don't have to create yourself. So that's the point of question 1, is to look at what his issue is and to look at what's available online. You might be already aware of some things, you might need to go and look for other things, and provide explanation, provide a rationale for why you've chosen those resources. So that's the first question. So there's a fair bit in that. The second question is to explore your role as Dale's mentor and how this differs from clinical supervision, preceptorship, and clinical facilitation. So you are Dale's mentor. You are not Dale's facilitator, and you're not his supervisor. You're not his clinical supervisor, and you're not doing clinical facilitation. We'll be looking at all of those things in the modules as we go through the subject, but you need to explain, you need to differentiate how your role as his mentor is not the same thing as those issues. Dale has been in your workplace for 2 years. I'll show you the scenario in a moment. That will be different to someone who's just arrived to the ward who's doing a 4-week placement. So if you've working in a clinical area and you've got a student that's just here for a few weeks and they're not actually working for us, they're not an employee, they're a student as an undergraduate doing their placement, that is a different process to mentoring someone that works for us. There's going to be differences in how that plays out. So look at that. Tell us how those things are different. Look at what the role of a mentor actually means, and then how that's differentiated from these other roles that you might take on as an educator as well. So that's what question 2 is about. Question 3 is to identify and appraise how transformational leadership can contribute to the process of change through clinical education in this scenario. So obviously the change that we want to get to for this person is from not yet competent or not meeting satisfactory levels of whatever they need to do, to getting them to a level that's satisfactory and performing well in their job. So that's the change that we want to see. The process of change, you need to read into this. It's not just he'll go from one to the other, boom, done. But you need to look into what the person needs to be ready for to change. They need to be able to see the need for change and all those sort of things. So the process of change is relatively complicated. Look into that. Find different places, different resources that talk about how change occurs and change management, and talk about what you're going to need to do in your role of a support person to allow that change to happen, and what transformational leadership means to all that. So if you're trying to get a person to change from point A to point B, and you're going to be a driving force for how that change is going to happen, what is a transformational leader and how does that work in that situation? So that's what the question's about. Identify and appraise how transformational leadership can contribute to the process of change through clinical education in this scenario. Next question is to summarise your evidence-based recommendations for Dale to record and track his continuing professional development. Provide rationales to support your recommendations. So this is a more broad question, I guess. You can hammer in on the particular issue that you're helping him with, but let's assume also that he's not particularly great at managing his continuing professional development, and he might be doing bits and pieces of stuff, but he's really not tracking it particularly well. So come up with some evidence-based recommendations, things that you've got support for, about how you might keep track of the CPD that you've done. And that what you'll be building into his learning will be how to keep evidence of what he's done. And if you think about it, now's an excellent time to do that, because if you've got a suite of 4 or 5 things that you've got together to support him with this learning need, and they're going to help him get from not understanding to understanding something, that's a list that you'll need to give back to the manager and say, this is what we've been working on, and this is where Dale's now able to do these things, and this is the evidence I've got that he's done all this learning. But you're also modelling how to track CPD. If he's done 4 or 5 things, that's all CPD that needs to be kept in his portfolio, or however else he keeps that information. So modelling that behaviour and helping him make sure he understands his CPD requirements is another point there. So summarise your evidence-based recommendations for Dale. What are you going to tell Dale on how he might record and track his CPD? And you need to give us your evidence, your rationales to support each of those recommendations. Then finally, you're going to outline the methods that you would use to evaluate if your mentorship of Dale has achieved the intended outcome of this relationship. So sometimes you can be asked to mentor someone, and if that's not evaluated well, you can sort of exist in this relationship that merges and morphs into a friendship rather than a mentorship, which isn't the purpose of mentorship. It sort of stops eventually, and you stop meeting together. For a mentorship to be successful, you need to have an agreement at the start of it that it's what we both want to do. I'm the mentor and you're the person wanting to be mentored, and this is how the relationship's going to work. You have agreed outcomes. You decide that this is what we want to achieve in this relationship. You agree on rules around how often you're going to meet and how that's going to work, and you stick to the rules. And you also have a termination phase. There's got to be a process at where that finishes, and you look back on the relationship and say, did that work? Did it not work? How could it have been better? What are we going to move on to now? Is this the end? Are you now going to be the mentor for someone else, or will Dale take on a mentorship role himself, or any of those sort of questions come at the end of that mentorship relationship. So outline the methods that you would use to evaluate if your mentorship of Dale has achieved the intended outcomes. So have a think about how will you know if it's worked? What would be the indicators that Dale has now been successfully mentored and you have successfully mentored him, and that relationship worked well? How would you decide that's been the case? So provide rationales to support your methods. That's the end. So there's a fair bit in it. It's worth 60%. It's a large assessment item, I acknowledge that, and it's got a lot of different parts to it that you can sort of work on as individual little sort of sections, I think, but it'll address a lot of the learning outcomes. So it will help us look at transformational leadership and how that contributes to change, how to critically appraise the effective teaching and learning initiatives in the clinical setting, how to identify, appraise and implement models of clinical supervision, preceptorship, clinical companion mentoring and clinical facilitation, and to be able to identify and apply CPD opportunities which meet professional learning needs and contribute to professional practice in clinical education, to use strategies to provide evidence of CPD, and to be able to demonstrate competence in the use of computer technology in teaching and learning, which is why the first question asks you to use online resources rather than just regular resources. You might have an absolutely brilliant local learning package that you've developed or that someone else in your area has developed. I want something that's accessible online. So, and part of that will encourage you to use computer technology and the internet to be able to find that. So that's going to help you get those learning outcomes done. Now, looking at the rubric, you've got, similar to assessment 1, you've got each content point has also got a part underneath it that rewards how well you've used evidence. So if you've written a really great response and it's a bit weak on how much support it's got in it, we'll be able to split those marks in these rubrics. So it's important that if you're trying to aim for a really high mark, that one, you've done a really great job of answering each question, but you've also supported it with lots of good quality resources. So if you're looking through, each of the questions has got a content area, so it's pretty straightforward. It's all the same as the questions we've gone through. And then down towards the bottom, there's 20% in this paper instead of the 10% in the previous paper. That gives marks for style and presentation. So in the first paper, it's not worth a huge amount, but it's worth taking note of the marks that you've lost or that you've been given to help direct you in assessment 2. So use the first assessment with comments about your referencing and the way you've structured your paragraphs and all those sort of things to build into your second paper and do better with the second one. And once again, we'll be putting your papers through Turnitin. So that's the assessment. It's got the same comments about how the paper needs to be, put together. And your response must be supported with current less than 7 years and peer-reviewed literature. If you have a seminal work that's older than that, that's fine. If you've got a really important article or a really important textbook that someone's written that has shaped the way people think about that particular concept for the last 10 years or 15 years or whatever, that's fine, you can put those in. But if you're putting in if a lot of your references are older and there are more current editions of the book or there are there's just more current evidence around the area that you're talking about, you can expect to lose some marks and get some comments about that. But if you have got the odd older than 7 years reference, that'll be okay. So you've got comments about referencing and so on here. So that's assessment 2. Okay, so the decent amount of work to do. lots of little points. Oh, I'll just show you the scenarios as well. So on the I2 site, you've got under the learning content and activities, you've got the modules, Easts and grades and so on, and then you've got the Dale scenario. If you click on this, this is where I've put the information for the scenario. So if you're a nurse or you've got a nursing background and you want to answer it from a nursing perspective, I've got Dale as a nurse that needs help with his medication calculations. If you're a radiographer, I think we've got a couple of those. I've put in a radiography scenario. Keep in mind that I'm not a radiographer, so if I have consulted with a radiographer lecturer about this particular scenario, but if you wanted to talk to me about how feasible and realistic it is, you can do that. And if you're from an area, you're a clinical area that is not one of these two things, I haven't really found anybody yet in this subject that's not a nurse or a radiographer. That may be the case. If you're a person that has a different clinical background, different specialty that you'd like to do, please contact me via email. I'd love to talk to you about what you might do instead, because I can make Dale, I can adapt this scenario for you to fit your clinical area as well. But we've got a nursing and a radiography example. If you'd like me to work on an occupational therapy or a dietitian or something like that, I'm very happy to do that with you. So just email me to let me know that you want to get a scenario more specific to your discipline. Alright, good luck, and don't hesitate to jump on the discussion forums or to send me an email and we can discuss your assessment.